The Galactic Council watched Earth burn, then the stars began screaming. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the silence of space, which I had grown used to over 7 years aboard Kestrel Station. That kind of silence was clean, almost peaceful. This silence was different. It had weight. It pressed against my ears and my chest and the back of my throat, and it tasted like burnt metal. I pulled myself upright using a bent support rail. My helmet display was cracked across the left side, flickering numbers I could not fully read. My right arm was fine. My left arm was not something I wanted to look at directly. The emergency lighting in the station corridor had gone red, which meant primary power was gone. Secondary power was gone. What remained was battery-fed, good for maybe 6 more hours. I had been unconscious for 11 minutes. The station's internal clock told me that much at least. Kestrel Station orbited at 400 kilometers above Earth. That was usually close enough to feel like home, close enough that on a clear day through the observation ports you could pick out coastlines, mountain ranges, the pale blue sprawl of the Atlantic. I pushed myself toward the nearest intact port and looked down. There was no blue left. The clouds were orange and brown, lit from below by something that had no business being there. Great spiraling columns of smoke rose from 3 separate continents, spreading outward at the edges like spilled ink. The Terminator line, the boundary between day and night on Earth's surface, was invisible. The night side was lit just as brightly as the day side, but the light was wrong. It was the flat, angry red of things that had stopped being what they were and become something else entirely. I turned away from the port and kept moving. The command deck was a ruin. 3 of my crew were gone, not missing, gone, pulled out through a hull breach that had since sealed itself via emergency foam. Lieutenant Owen Carr had been at the main console when the first wave hit. There was nothing left of the console. There was nothing left of Owen. I said his name quietly once, and then I stopped saying it, because if I kept saying it I would stop moving, and stopping was not something I could afford. Commander Priya Hollies had been in the medical bay when the second wave struck. I found her there, alive, her face gray and her leg badly broken. She had splinted it herself using a cabinet handle and 2 lengths of wire. She looked up at me when I came through the hatch, and her first question was not about her leg or the pain or the station. Her first question was, "Are they still out there?" I told her I had not checked yet. She told me to go check. I went back to what remained of the sensor array and ran a passive scan. Active scanning would broadcast our position, and I had already made a decision without consciously making it, the way you sometimes do in emergencies, that announcing ourselves loudly was not wise yet. The passive scan took 4 minutes to compile because 3 of the processing nodes were fused. When the results came through, I read them twice. Then I read them a third time. 17 fleets, 17 separate groupings of alien vessels, each one positioned at a distance of between 2 and 6 light seconds from Earth's orbit, each one holding perfectly still. Each one broadcasting on open council frequencies, which meant their communication arrays were active. They were not having technical difficulties. They were not hiding. They were simply sitting there. 17 fleets representing 11 different species, and somewhere between 600 and 800 individual warships, watching Earth burn from a comfortable and very deliberate distance. I had learned about the Galactic Council in the same way most humans my age had learned about it. In pieces, over years, through announcements that the major governments released carefully, and in language designed to prevent panic. First contact had happened 11 years ago, not with one species, but with a delegation of 4, representatives of something called the Interstellar Accord of Recognized Civilizations, which was the Council's formal name. Humans had spent 3 years trying to be friendly, and another 2 trying to be impressive. The Council had spent those same 5 years conducting what they called an evaluative survey, which was their formal process for deciding whether a newly discovered species was worth acknowledging. Humanity had received observer status 14 months ago. It had felt like an achievement at the time. Observer status meant we could attend council sessions. We could submit testimony. We could place requests for information. We could not vote. We could not enter into binding agreements. We could not request military assistance, because military assistance was reserved for full member civilizations, and full membership required a Tier 4 technological rating, and humanity was rated at Tier 2. The Volcae hegemony, the species currently in the process of removing human civilization from the surface of our own planet, were rated at Tier 6. They had informed the Council 60 days ago that Earth represented an evolutionary obstruction. That was their term. An evolutionary obstruction was a species that, by the hegemony's internal doctrine, showed signs of becoming a competitor within the next 200 years, and therefore needed to be resolved before that happened. The Council had reviewed the notification. The Council had noted that the Volcae were within their rights under the Non-Interference Protocol, which protected Tier 6 civilizations from Council intervention in what were classified as sovereign civilizational decisions. The Council had logged the notification and distributed it to all member states. Humanity's observer delegation had received a copy of that log 11 days ago. They had filed a formal objection. The objection had been received and catalogued. The 17 fleets sitting outside Earth's orbit had all received the same notification. They had all watched it arrive. They had done nothing then, and they were doing nothing now. I opened a channel to Priya. They are 17 fleets, I said. Council-affiliated, all of them holding position. No one is moving. There was a long pause from her end. Send a distress call, she said. Standard format, all council frequencies. They already know, I said. Send it anyway, she said. I sent it. I used every council-registered frequency band the station's battered array could still reach. I sent our coordinates, our status, our crew count. I sent footage from the external cameras, the footage of the orange and brown clouds and the red light and the smoke columns. I attached our ship's identification codes and our observer status registration number. I transmitted it as a repeating signal, so it would keep going even if I stopped being able to maintain it manually. For 22 minutes, I watched the signal travel outward and wash against 17 fleets. Not one of them changed course. Not one of them opened a channel back. Several of them, I noted, updated their observation logs. They were recording everything. They were just not responding to any of it. Priya did not say anything when I told her. She stared at the ceiling of the medical bay for a while. Then she asked me if there was anything left on Earth, any signal, any broadcast, any indication that the surface networks were still operating. I ran the scan. There was nothing. The last surface broadcast had gone quiet 4 minutes before I regained consciousness. There was a faint carrier wave from somewhere deep in the southern hemisphere, too faint and too distorted to decode. Otherwise, silence. You need to make a record, Priya said quietly, while you still can. She was right. I knew she was right. Station power was dropping. The battery reserves were not going to hold much longer, and when they went, the communication array would go with them, and then there would be no record at all except whatever the 17 fleets were logging in their own files. I found the station's emergency beacon unit in the secondary equipment locker. It was a human design, old, built in the years before first contact, before anyone worried about council standards or interstellar compatibility. It ran on its own sealed power cell, good for 200 hours of continuous transmission. It was not sophisticated. It did not need to be. I held it in my hands for a moment. Then I pressed record. This is Commander Selin Ayaz, Commanding Officer of Earth Orbital Defense Station Kestrel. Current stardate is the 14th of March. I am speaking from low Earth orbit. Kestrel Station is critically damaged. My crew of 9 is reduced to 2 survivors. Earth's surface has gone silent. I paused, through the cracked port beside me. The orange glow of my burning world reflected off my visor. 17 Council-affiliated fleets observed this event from positions between 2 and 6 light seconds. All 17 received our distress signal. None responded. I have logged their hull signatures, their transponder frequencies, and the timestamp of every observation log update they filed while Earth was being destroyed. I paused again. I was not sure what I wanted to say next. Then I was. Humans have very long memories. We remember everything that was done to us and everything that was not done for us when it should have been. I want whoever receives this to understand something clearly. We are not finished. We are not asking for sympathy. We are not asking for anything. I looked back through the port one more time. We are making a record, because that is what you do when something wrong happens. You record it, you remember it, and then when you are ready, you do something about it. I sealed the beacon and set it transmitting on a slow outward spiral, away from the station, away from Earth, out toward the 17 fleets and the stars beyond them. Then I went back to find Priya and figure out how to keep us alive long enough for it to matter. The Council ship that retrieved me was called the Luminous Accord, which was either a very hopeful name or a very ironic one. I leaned toward ironic, given the circumstances. It was an Elurian vessel. The Elurians were one of the 11 species represented in the Council fleets that had held position outside Earth's orbit. Their fleet had been the closest, sitting at just under 2 light seconds, near enough that their long-range optical sensors would have given them a clear view of the cloud formation spreading over my planet. Their captain's name was Velorath, and he came to speak to me personally on my 3rd day aboard. He was tall, pale gray, with 4 upper limbs, and a way of moving that suggested everything he did had been carefully considered before he did it. He sat across from me in the small room they had given me, and folded 2 of his hands together in what my neural lace told me was a formal gesture of acknowledgement. "You are the observer-class survivor," he said. His translator rendered his voice into flat, clean English. "Commander Selen Ayaz of Earth Station Kestrel." "That is correct," I said. "You will be transported to the Council Assembly at Meridian Station," he said. "Your testimony has been requested as part of the formal record-keeping process for this event. You will be given time to speak. The session is in 41 days. Until then, you are a guest aboard this vessel." Guest, I turned the word over in my head for a while after he left. Priya was not with me. She had been taken to a medical facility on a station called Harith Point, the nearest Elurian medical installation capable of handling her injuries. We had said goodbye quickly and without enough words. She had grabbed my wrist before they separated us and said, "Remember every detail, every single one." I had told her I would. I spent the 41 days of transit doing exactly that. The neural lace they had fitted me with was standard Council issue, designed to allow cross-species communication. It did its intended job efficiently, but it also gave me access to Council public archives, and I had a great deal of uninterrupted time, so I read. I read the full text of the Council Charter. I read the non-interference protocol. I read the complete tier classification system and the academic papers that had been published over the past 3 centuries arguing for and against its various provisions. I read the Council session transcripts from the 60-day period between the Volkai notification and the beginning of their operation against Earth. Our observer delegation had filed 22 separate objections. Each one had been formally received. Each one had been catalogued. Each one had triggered a procedural review that concluded, each time, that the Council had no grounds to intervene in a Volkai sovereign civilizational decision regarding a Tier 2 species. No grounds to intervene. Those 4 words appeared in the transcripts 11 times across the 22 reviews. I also read the tier classification system in full, not the summary version that the Council distributed to new observer species, but the complete technical document, all 412 pages of it. The tier system was based primarily on measurable energy output. a civilization's ability to harness, store, and deploy energy across various scales. Tier 1 was planetary. Tier 2 was early interplanetary. Tier 3 was developed interplanetary with early interstellar capability. Tier 4 was full interstellar. Tier 5 and above involved energy manipulation at stellar and above stellar scales. Humanity was Tier 2. We had fusion reactors, early FTL research, and an interplanetary infrastructure that was still being built out when the Volkai arrived. What the tier system did not measure, I noticed, was tactical adaptability. It did not measure innovation rate under pressure. It did not measure how a species behaved when it was cornered, when the normal rules of survival no longer applied. The classification system was built on the assumption that the most powerful civilizations were the ones with the most energy at their disposal. It had never seriously considered that there might be kinds of power that did not show up in energy output measurements. I wrote all of this down. I did not know yet exactly what I was going to do with it. I just knew that keeping the information only in my head was not enough. On the 38th day of transit, I was given the formal briefing packet for my council testimony. It informed me that I would be speaking in the Grand Assembly Chamber at Meridian Station, in the presence of representatives from all 340 council member species and 47 observer species. I would be introduced as a survivor witness. I would be given 90 seconds to speak. 90 seconds was the standard allocation for observer testimony, because observer status did not carry voting rights, and therefore observer testimony was classified as supplementary rather than substantive. 90 seconds. I read that line 3 times. Then I read the rest of the packet. There was a suggested framework for survivor testimony, a gentle document written in language that wanted to be kind, but landed somewhere closer to patronizing. It recommended that survivors focus on factual recounting rather than emotional appeals. It noted that the council was not a judicial body and could not assign liability for events that fell within the non-interference protocol. It expressed, in careful and thoroughly hedged language, something that was meant to feel like condolence. I set the packet aside and spent the remaining 3 days preparing what I was actually going to say. The Grand Assembly Chamber at Meridian Station was larger than I had expected, which was saying something because I had expected it to be very large. The ceiling was far enough above the floor that atmospheric perspective made it hazy at the edges. The seating rose in curved tiers around a central speaking platform. 340 delegations occupied those tiers. I could not distinguish most of them by species from the platform. They were too far away and too varied, but I could feel the weight of their attention. A council arbiter, a species called the Theresi, introduced me with practiced brevity. She noted my name, my former rank, my species, and my observer registration number. She noted that Earth was now classified as a disrupted observer world under the non-interference protocol. She noted that my testimony was being received as supplementary record and would be archived in the event log. Then she gestured toward the speaking platform. I walked to the center of it. I had 90 seconds. I stood there and said nothing. 10 seconds passed, 20. I could hear, or imagined I could hear, a shift in the quality of the silence in the chamber. 30 seconds, 40. Someone near the back made a sound that the neural lace translated as procedural concern. 50 seconds. At the 58th second, I spoke. I spent the last 41 days reading your charter, I said. Every page of it. I understand the non-interference protocol. I understand the tier classification system. I understand why, under your rules, everything that happened to Earth was technically legal. I paused for exactly 2 seconds. I want you to understand something in return. We counted the fleets that watched. We memorized every hull signature, every transponder frequency, every timestamp in every observation log that was updated while my world was on fire. Humans have very good memories, particularly for things that should not have happened. Another pause. We also have very good memories for who was there. I stopped. The 90 seconds were not yet expired. I had used 62 of them. I let the remaining 28 sit in the chamber, taking up space, refusing to be filled. The arbiter thanked me. Her tone was careful, measured, the tone of someone who was not sure what they had just heard but had decided to treat it as manageable. I was escorted back to a waiting area by 2 council stewards who also said nothing. The holding room they had assigned me was small and smelled of recycled air. I sat on the edge of the sleeping platform and looked at the opposite wall. I was not sure what I felt. I had imagined this moment for 41 days, the moment of speaking in front of the council, and now that it had happened, I felt less like someone who had accomplished something, and more like someone who had placed the first piece of something much larger onto a board, without yet knowing what the rest of the pieces were. Then the communication panel in the wall chimed. I crossed the room and opened the channel. The signal was low power, tightly encrypted, and clearly not routed through any council communication infrastructure. It had bounced through at least 4 relay points before reaching me, which was deliberate. Whoever sent it did not want the council to know it existed. The signal resolved into a voice. Human, female, speaking English with an accent I recognized as belonging to the eastern coastal cities of what had been the old Pacific Rim Alliance. Commander Ayez, the voice said, my name is not important yet. What is important is that you should know we are still here, all of us. We went down, not away. Down. There is more below the surface of this world than the hegemony burned. We have been building for 6 months. We will keep building. The channel closed before I could respond. I sat back down on the sleeping platform and stared at the communication panel for a long time. They had gone underground. 340 million people, or whatever number had survived, and they had not scattered into space or surrendered or ended. They had done what humans do when the surface becomes impossible. They had found what was underneath it, and they had started working. I thought about that for the rest of the night. By the time the Elurian stewards came to tell me my transport was ready, I had made a decision so clear and so simple that I was almost surprised it had taken me as long as it did. I was going home. The place they called Marrow was 2 kilometers below what had once been the northern edge of a mountain range. I would not tell you which mountain range, not because I do not trust you, but because some pieces of information belong to the people who made them and should travel on their terms, not mine. I was brought in through a shaft that had been cut at a 30-degree angle through compressed rock and sealed earth, the kind of engineering that takes heavy machines and enormous effort, and a very clear reason to bother. The shaft was lined with cable bundles, pipe runs, and a single-track rail system that moved cargo in both directions on a quiet, battery-driven platform. No noise that might carry to the surface. No light signature that might bleed through ground sensors. The person who met me at the bottom of the shaft was short, unhurried, and had eyes that had the specific quality of belonging to someone who had not slept enough for a long time, but had made a decision not to care about that. His name was Owen Aldridge, and he ran the engineering division of what he called the Marrow Collective. "You made it back," he said, as if he had been expecting me. Maybe he had. "How did you know I was coming?" I asked. "We heard your council address," he said. 62 seconds, we counted. He turned and started walking down the main corridor, and I followed. "Director Mwangi wants to see you when you are ready, but first you should see this." This was Marrow itself. I had expected a bunker. I had expected low ceilings and dim light and the specific misery of people surviving in a space that was not designed for long-term habitation. What I found instead was a city, not a finished one, not a comfortable one. The walls were raw rock in most places, and the ceilings were supported by a forest of structural columns that had been driven into the stone at calculated intervals. The light came from strings of industrial panels that cast everything in a bright, flat white. But people moved through the corridors with the purposeful speed of people who had places to be, not the shuffling tread of people who were simply enduring. There were workshops along both sides of the main corridor, open-fronted spaces where teams worked at tables covered in components, schematics, and equipment in various states of assembly. There were children, which surprised me until it should not have, because of course there were children, they had come down here too. Some of them were helping, carrying parts, running errands between workrooms, in the way of children who have been told that what they are doing matters and have believed it. How many people? I asked Owen. In Marrow specifically, 46,000, he said. Across all 6 networks, the most recent count is 328 million. He said it the way you say a number that you have had time to sit with and have decided to treat as a fact rather than a wound. The surface bombardment missed the deep network nodes. The hegemony scanning technology cannot see through high-density geological strata at more than 1 kilometer. We are at 2 or more everywhere. They had known this. Not before the bombardment, not in time to save the surface, but someone had read the technical specifications for Volkai scanning systems, had understood their limitation, and had used that knowledge to place the deep bunkers exactly where they needed to be. Director Haruto Mwangi met me in a long room that had been converted into a working space by the simple method of putting tables in it and covering those tables with work. He was sitting at the far end, going over something on a display that showed columns of numbers. He looked up when I came in, nodded, and gestured at the chair across from him. He was older than I had expected, gray at the temples, with the kind of hands that had done practical work at some point in his life and had not forgotten it. He studied me for a moment without speaking, which felt like an assessment rather than a pause. "You spoke 62 seconds, he said. "Yes," I said. "Good," he said. "Long speeches from weak positions are noise. Short speeches from weak positions are interesting. They suggest the person making them knows something." He set down the display. "Do you know something, Commander?" "I think I might," I said, "but I would like to know what you know first." He stood and moved to the wall on the left side of the room. The wall was covered floor to ceiling in writing, not on screens but on physical surface, calculations and diagrams and annotated lists in multiple hands, the kind of record that gets built not by one person planning but by many people thinking in the same direction. "We lost the surface," Mwangi said. "We know that. We are not going to pretend otherwise, but the hegemony made an error. They evaluated our civilizational threat level based on what we were doing, not on what we could have been doing if we had been pushed." He tapped one of the equations. "They assessed our energy output, our manufacturing capacity, our FTL research timeline. They saw a species that was 50 years from being a real interstellar presence. They calculated that removing us now was cheaper than removing us later." "They were calculating something real," I said. "Yes," he agreed, "but they were calculating the wrong variable. They looked at what we had. They did not look at what we do when we have no other options." He turned to face me. "Do you know what the fastest developing period in human technology has been, historically?" I thought about it. "Wartime," I said. "Every time," he said. "Every single time without exception. When the pressure is low, we develop slowly. When the pressure becomes extreme, we develop at a rate that looks, from the outside, like something that should not be possible." He moved along the wall to a different section, this one covered in schematics that I could see were spacecraft designs, nothing like anything in the current human catalog. "We have had 6 months of the most extreme pressure in human history. 6 months of 300 million people who have lost the surface of their world, and have nothing left to lose and nothing to do except work." He showed me the designs. The ships were called grief drives internally, an unofficial name that had come from the engineering teams and stuck because it was accurate. The formal designation was matter annihilation impulse vessels. The physics behind them was not new. Humans had understood the theoretical basis for matter annihilation energy since the early part of the century. The reason no one had built a functional drive on those principles before was not ignorance. It was caution. The energy yields were extraordinary. Catastrophically extraordinary, in the sense that the early models had produced energetic outputs that no existing containment system could manage without catastrophic failure. 6 months ago, an engineer named Clara Osai, working in the Marrow network, had solved the containment problem. Not by containing the energy better, but by directing its vector precisely, releasing it in a focused annihilation cascade that translated directly to propulsion rather than dispersing as heat. The solution was, in retrospect, not elegant. It was blunt and aggressive, and used far more raw force than any conventional engineering philosophy would recommend. It worked. The propulsion output is approximately 40 times that of our best existing FTL system, Owen told me the next day, walking me through the first completed prototype in the machine bay. Travel time from Earth to the Council Assembly Station drops from 41 days to less than 30 hours. I stood in front of the ship and looked at it. It was not beautiful. It was not supposed to be. It was a functional object built by people who were not interested in beauty, who were interested in results. The hull was dark, a matte coating that absorbed radar and reduced optical signature. It was not large, comparable in size to a heavy human frigate, but the drive section at the rear was disproportionate. The kind of mass allocation that meant the engineers had decided that the engine mattered more than anything else. "How many?" I asked. Owen was quiet for a moment. 17, he said. I turned to look at him. "One for each fleet that watched," he said simply. Each of the 17 ships had a single white line painted along the portside hull, not a decoration, not a unit marking, a tally mark. I asked Clara Osai, who I met later that week, whether she understood what the ships were going to be used for. She was younger than I expected, direct in the way of someone who had spent 6 months focused on a single problem and had not had time to become complicated about anything. "Yes," she said. "And you are comfortable with that?" I asked. She looked at me steadily. "The Volcae are preparing a second audit," she said. "I read the Council intercepts. The next target is the Illurians Tier 3, not high enough for protection, not low enough to be ignored forever." She paused. "The Illurian ship retrieved you, yes?" "Yes," I said. "Then we have a reason," she said. "Not revenge, a reason." I thought about Captain Velorath, who had come to speak to me in careful, formal language, and had transported me to the Council in the full knowledge that the Council would not do anything meaningful. He had done it anyway, maybe because it was procedure, maybe because some part of him had believed it should be done regardless of outcome. It was not enough, but it was something. The 17 ships were ready in 4 months. The day they rose up through the launch shafts at 6 sites across the network, breaking surface for the first time in almost a year, I was standing on the observation deck of the lead vessel. The surface of Earth above me was gray and scarred, but at the edges of my visible range I could see thin lines of pale green where the first growth was coming back. Slow, fragile, undeniable. I did not look at it for long. We had work to do. The Illurian system had 4 inhabited planets and a defensive fleet of 60 ships. Against a hegemony audit force of 200, those 60 ships had been allocated to evacuation and civilian dispersal, because the Illurian military command had correctly calculated that they could not win a direct engagement, and had decided that saving lives was the better use of their resources. When we dropped out of FTL, I was in the command chair of a ship that did not yet have a formal name. The crew had started calling it the First Mark because it was the lead vessel, the one with the first tally line. I was using that name too. The hegemony fleet was already in formation, deep in the system, 3 hours from its first engagement position. Our approach vector put us directly between them and the primary Elurian inhabited planet. The hegemony opened a communication channel almost immediately. They were not accustomed to being approached rather than approached by other vessels. The communication came through in the hegemony's primary language, which my neural lace translated in real time. Unidentified vessels. You are operating in a declared hegemony audit zone. Withdraw immediately or be classified as hostile interference. I noted something as I listened. The voice was confident. Not arrogant exactly, but settled. The voice of someone who had done this many times before and had no particular expectation of anything new happening. I let the channel sit open for 6 seconds before responding. "This is the first mark," I said. "Earth-registered vessel. We are not withdrawing." There was a pause on their end that was longer than the communication delay could account for. They were checking our registration. They were, I suspected, running our whole configuration through their databases and finding nothing that matched. "Earth," the voice said finally, "is a disrupted observer world. It has no registered military vessels." "We updated our registration this morning," I said. That was true. Owen had filed the paperwork through the observer channel 6 hours before departure, on the grounds that technically we were still an observer species, and the registration system had not specifically excluded us. "You have 17 vessels," the hegemony commander said. "We have 200. "Yes," I said, "I know." I closed the outgoing channel and opened the fleet channel instead. "All ships," I said, "transmit targeting solutions." During the 30 hours of transit from Earth to the Elurian system, every analyst, every engineer, and several hundred volunteers had been working on a single document, a complete targeting map of the hegemony fleet's command infrastructure. Every fleet of 200 ships has a command structure. It has flagship nodes, communication relay ships, coordination vessels, and the specific ships that carry the officers whose decisions the rest of the fleet depends on. Remove those nodes precisely and quickly enough, and the remaining ships default to autonomous protocols that, for most military forces, meant dispersal and return to base rather than continued engagement. We had identified 31 such nodes in the hegemony fleet. We had a targeting solution for each one. The work behind that document was staggering in its detail. Ren Kaplan, our tactical analyst, had spent the entire transit period awake, sustained by something she called personal willpower, and what the rest of us quietly suspected was the last of the good coffee in the supply locker. She had cross-referenced 6 months of intercepted hegemony communication logs, the publicly available operational doctrine that the hegemony had filed with the Council as part of their standard military transparency disclosures, and 3 separate models of fleet command behavior built by the Marrow Network strategy teams. The hegemony filed military transparency disclosures because the Council required them. They had never expected those disclosures to be used by a Tier 2 species to map their command structure and build a precision targeting plan. They had expected them to be noted, filed, and ignored. That was what observer species did with information. They received it and said thank you. We had read everything they sent and treated it as intelligence. Petra Yates, our systems engineer, had spent the same 30 hours calibrating the pulse charges on each of the 17 ships to account for the variations in hegemony command ship hull thickness, which differed across the various vessel classes in ways that required individual targeting adjustments. She had done this from schematics obtained through the same transparency disclosure system. She had calibrated 17 ships worth of ordnance without sleep, without complaint, and with the specific focused energy of someone who understood that getting the calibration wrong would mean the difference between a disabled command ship and a cloud of debris that complicated everything. Dan Whitfield had plotted the micro-jump insertion trajectories. This was the part that had given everyone the most concern during the planning phase. Because inserting 17 ships into the interior of a 200-ship formation at close range, while simultaneously achieving viable targeting angles on 31 specific vessels, required a degree of precision that was, on paper, outside the known parameters of grief drive navigation. Dan had spent a week at Marrow before departure building a simulation of the Elurian system's gravitational topology and running the insertion approach 11,000 times with variations in fleet formation and drive timing, until he found a solution that worked consistently enough that he was willing to stake 17 ships on it. He had run it 11,047 times. He had told me 47 was the number of runs where something in the result had surprised him enough that he wanted to understand why, and understanding why had made the solution better each time. I gave the fleet 20 seconds to confirm their solutions were locked. "First mark locked," Dan reported. "Second mark locked," came the next voice. "Third mark locked." All the way down to 17. Then I said, "Micro jump, execute." The grief drives fired. I have no way to adequately describe what a micro jump looks like from inside the vessel performing it. The standard FTL experience involves a sensation of acceleration, followed by a period that the human brain does not process normally, and then arrival. A micro jump is different because the transit time is not measured in minutes or hours, but in fractions of a second. The start and the end are almost simultaneous. What happens in between is something the human nervous system registers as a single sharp moment of complete discontinuity, as if a frame of experience has been cut and replaced with another frame taken from an entirely different location. 17 ships jumped from the system perimeter into the interior of the hegemony formation. Not close to it, not near it, into it, among the fleet ships through the gaps in their formation, appearing at distances of between 2 and 15 kilometers from their nearest command nodes. In the 3 seconds following the jump, I watched the hegemony fleet's sensor response on my display. They had detected us. Of course they had detected us. We were not trying to be invisible. We were inside their formation, close enough that their point defense systems were lighting up with proximity alerts, and those systems were the automated kind, the ones that fired based on range rather than command authorization, which meant that 17 hegemony vessels opened fire on us the moment we appeared. Our hull coatings were not armor in any conventional sense. What Clara Osai's team had built into the hull material was a reflection lattice, a grid of microscopic electromagnetic deflectors tuned to the specific frequency range of Volkai pattern energy weapons, which the hegemony used as standard. The lattice did not absorb the energy. It redirected it in scattered vectors away from the hull surface. Not perfectly. Nothing was perfect. But well enough for the 3 seconds it needed to work. The targeting solutions fired simultaneously. Not energy weapons, not the kind that required sustained contact to be effective. Focused pulse charges, each one precisely calculated to disable without structural destruction, because we needed the command ships non-functional, not vaporized. Vaporized ships produced debris. Debris complicated the situation. Non-functional ships sat still and waited, which was exactly what we wanted them to do. 31 command nodes went silent in 40 seconds. 43 seconds. I remember that because I was counting, because counting was something to do while the system display updated, and the confirmation reports came in from each of the 16 other ships. 43 seconds from jump completion to the last command node going offline. The remaining 169 hegemony vessels began their autonomous dispersal protocol exactly as predicted. They were not retreating in the emotional sense. Their systems were executing the only instruction set available to them once the command structure went down. Without commanders to issue orders, the ships did what they had been programmed to do in the event of command loss. They moved to their nearest pre-designated rally point and waited for command to be re-established. The dispersal would carry them out of the system at standard FTL speeds, which meant that with their slower drives, they would be traveling for days before reaching a staging point. We knew where every hegemony staging point was. We had read their operational doctrine in detail. We would be at those points before they arrived. I opened the fleet-wide channel again. All ships hold position, do not pursue, maintain formation. A chorus of acknowledgments came back. 17 voices, each one calm, each one controlled, each one belonging to a person who had grown up in a world that no longer existed and had decided that this was what came next. Then I opened the council frequency. The 17 fleets that had held position outside Earth's orbit 11 months ago were in this sector. They had been sent to observe the Elurian situation, because the Council observed things. They were currently sitting at the edge of the system, watching everything that had just happened, and my sensors told me that their communication arrays were working very hard. I also noted that not a single one of the 17 Council fleets had moved during the engagement. They had observed the Hegemony fleet entering the Elurian system. They had observed the evacuation ships. They had observed 17 Earth-registered vessels emerge from FTL at the system perimeter. And they had observed the 43 seconds of the engagement itself, with the same careful, complete, perfectly detailed attention that they had given to the view from 2 light seconds outside Earth's orbit 11 months ago. The difference was what they had seen this time. I opened a direct channel to all 17 fleet commanders simultaneously. This is Commander Selin Ayaz of the 1st Mark, Earth Registry. I want to speak to all 17 of you at the same time, because I spoke to all 17 of you once before and none of you responded, and I think we should correct that. Silence for several seconds, long enough that Louise Farrar, standing at the communication station behind me, glanced at me with a question she did not say aloud. Then one channel opened. The voice on the other end was Theresi, a Theresi admiral. "Commander Ayaz," he said, "what you have done today will require significant council review." "I understand," I said. "While the council is reviewing it, I would like to tell you what we are doing next. The Hegemony fleet will regroup at their staging points in approximately 72 to 96 hours. We will be at those points when they arrive. We will repeat this engagement as many times as necessary until the Hegemony acknowledges that their audit operations against non-Tier 4 species are no longer without consequence." Another silence. "You are Tier 2, the Admiral said. "You cannot successfully engage a Tier 6 civilization." "Admiral," I said, "with great respect, you watched us do it 20 minutes ago." The channel stayed open. I could hear him breathing, or the sound his species made that the neural lace interpreted as breathing. I waited. I had learned patience in the past 11 months, not the passive kind, the kind that holds its position and lets the silence do the work. "How," he said finally, "did you do this?" It was the question I had been expecting, not from him specifically, from all of them, eventually. The question contained several smaller questions inside it. How did a Tier 2 species develop this technology? How did they plan and execute an engagement this precise? How did they know the Hegemony fleet's command structure in enough detail to target it so specifically? But underneath all of those technical questions was a different question, the one that I suspected had been sitting in his mind since the moment our ships appeared inside the Hegemony formation. How did you become something we did not anticipate? We had nothing left to lose, I said. That tends to focus the mind. I closed the channel and turned back to the system display in front of me. The Elurian evacuation ships were returning to the primary planet, their civilian passengers still aboard, no longer needed for dispersal. On an open Elurian frequency, I could hear transmission traffic that sounded, even through translation, like people who had just realized they were not going to be removed from their world today. The sound of it moved through me in a way I had not expected. I had been focused, completely and deliberately focused, for months on the technical and strategic problem, the human problem. The 328 million people underground, the 17 ships, the 31 command nodes. I had kept the emotional dimension at a careful distance because the emotional dimension was not something I could afford to carry at full weight while I was also trying to plan. Grief and rage are not good navigators. They tell you where you want to go but not how to get there. But hearing the Illyrian frequency, hearing whatever the sound of relief and survival was in a species that was not mine, something in me set down a weight I had not realized I was still carrying. I knew what it felt like to be on the planet side of that sound. I knew exactly what it felt like, and I was glad, in a way that was quieter and more complete than anything I had felt in 11 months, that someone else did not have to feel the alternative. Meridian Station looked the same as the last time I had been here. The same enormous berths, the same layered atmosphere of a place built for many different species to occupy simultaneously, the same quality of institutional weight that large governing bodies accumulate over time and carry the way old buildings carry the smell of everything that has ever happened inside them. But something was different, and I noticed it the moment our docking clearance came through. The docking controller, a Theresi operator who communicated in the standard clipped efficiency of port traffic management, addressed me by name rather than by ship registration code. That was not standard procedure. Standard procedure was registration code first, name optional. The fact that she led with my name meant she knew it, which meant she had been briefed, which meant someone at Meridian Station had decided that our arrival was significant enough to brief the docking staff about. I filed that observation away and said nothing. The Grand Assembly Chamber was full, fuller than my first visit if that was possible. 340 member delegations and 47 observer delegations, and additionally, seated in a section that had not existed the last time, delegations from 6 species who had not previously held any formal council standing. They had been placed there by a procedural motion filed 3 weeks before the session, co-signed by the Illyrian delegation and 5 others. The 6 non-standing delegations were species that the Volkai hegemony had completed audit operations against over the past 2 centuries, not destroyed. The hegemony did not destroy every species on its audit list. Some species, during the audit process, demonstrated what the hegemony's internal doctrine called acceptable trajectory deviation, meaning they changed their development path in ways the hegemony considered non-threatening. Those species were allowed to remain. They were, however, left in a state that the Council's own records described as interrupted development, which was a careful phrase for civilizations that had been deliberately set back by decades or centuries of targeted infrastructure removal and forced to rebuild from a reduced baseline. 6 of those civilizations had sent representatives to this session. They had not been invited by the Council. They had been invited by the Illyrian delegation, which had used a rarely exercised procedural mechanism that allowed full members to grant temporary floor access to non-registered parties for purposes of relevant testimony. The Council's chief arbiter had reviewed the mechanism before the session and confirmed it was technically valid. Her confirmation had been worded in the tone of someone who was not happy about the technical validity, but was committed to procedural integrity. I stood at the entrance to the chamber for a moment before going in. Beside me stood Owen Aldridge and Clara Osei, who had both insisted on coming. Behind me were 4 members of the First Mark's crew: Navigations Officer Dan Whitfield, Systems Engineer Petra Yates, Tactical Analyst Ren Kaplan, and our Junior Communications Officer, a 19-year-old from the Marrow Network named Louise Farrar, who had never been above the surface of Earth until 7 months ago, and who had, without complaint or drama, become one of the most effective crew members I had commanded. Louise had grown up in the Marrow Network. She had gone underground at the age of 18 during the first bombardment wave, had spent 3 weeks in a collapse zone with 17 other survivors before a rescue team reached her, and had then, upon being recovered and given the choice of any available role in the collective, asked to be assigned to the engineering teams working on the grief drives. She had no formal engineering background. She had a willingness to learn and a specific kind of mental endurance that the engineers recognized immediately and found very useful. By the time the first 17 ships were ready, she knew every system aboard the first Mark well enough to run any of them independently. I had offered her the communication station because it required exactly the combination of technical competence and calm under pressure that she had demonstrated in the collapse zone, and she had accepted without making it into anything larger than it was. She was 19 years old and she had never left Earth until 7 months ago, and now she was standing outside the Grand Assembly Chamber of the Galactic Council, and she was looking at the entrance the way you look at something you have decided to walk through. "Are you ready?" Owen asked me. "No," I said, "but that is not really the point, is it?" I walked in. The session was formally called to order by the Council's chief arbiter, a different individual from the Theresi arbiter, who had presided over my first testimony. This one was older, and she conducted the opening procedures with the focused precision of someone who had decided that precision was the only thing standing between order and something she was not prepared to name. Humanity's case was third on the agenda. First was a procedural review of the Elurian engagement, which was the official title that the Council had assigned to what we had done in the Elurian system 11 months ago. Second was a Volkai hegemony representation, which was their formal response to 17 subsequent engagements in which human vessels had intercepted hegemony audit fleets at staging points and disabled their command structures. We had done it 17 times, one for each fleet that had watched. The hegemony had sent progressively larger forces to each staging point as they adapted to the realization that the initial dispersal was not the end of the problem. They had sent 60 ships to the first staging point, then 90, then 120. Each time, the first Mark and its fleet had arrived before them, and each time, the engagement had lasted less than a minute because we had updated our targeting maps after each encounter, and the hegemony's command structure, despite their best efforts, followed patterns that were consistent enough to exploit. The hegemony had not stopped sending fleets, but they had stopped sending them toward Elurian-adjacent systems. 11 months of consistent interception had moved their operational footprint away from a particular cluster of space that now had 17 human ships as a persistent, unwelcome presence. The Volkai representative was a tall individual who carried the specific quality of someone who was not used to explaining themselves. He spoke for 22 minutes. The substance of his argument was that human military action constituted interference in hegemony, sovereign civilizational decisions, that this interference violated the non-interference protocol, and that the Council was obligated to order human vessels to stand down and permit the resumption of hegemony audit operations. He presented this argument with the calm of someone who had examined the protocol and concluded that it said what he needed it to say. He was correct that it said those things. He was also, I believed, about to discover a gap in his reasoning. When he finished, the arbiter turned to me. I had not been given a 90-second limit this time. The session brief had listed me as a primary testimony contributor, which meant I had as much time as I needed. I was going to use it carefully. I stood at the speaking platform and took a breath. The non-interference protocol, I said, protects Tier 6 civilizations from Council intervention in sovereign civilizational decisions. I have read that protocol many times. I have read the original drafting documents. I have read the debates that preceded its adoption. I understand why it was written and what it was designed to protect. I looked out at the chamber. It does not apply to us. A sound moved through the audience, the multilingual equivalent of a sharp collective intake of breath. The non-interference protocol protects Council member civilizations from Council intervention, I said. We are not the Council. We are an observer species. The protocol contains exactly one reference to observer species, in a footnote to the Third Amendment, which notes that observer species are not subject to Council enforcement actions. We have checked this with 4 separate legal consultants, 2 of whom were Volkai trained. I paused to let that land. We are not violating the non-interference protocol. We are operating in a legal space that the protocol simply does not cover, because when the protocol was written, no one imagined that a Tier 2 species would develop the capacity to do what we have been doing. The protocol has a gap. We fit in it. The Volkai representative made a sound. The arbiter called for order. Additionally, I said, I am presenting today not as a petition or a request. I am presenting a completed instrument. The Interstellar Civilizational Accountability Framework is a legal document co-drafted by human, Alurian, and 4 other participating species legal teams. It establishes a tribunal mechanism for deliberate civilizational harm. It does not require Council adoption to be operational. It requires only the ratification of its signatory species, which has already occurred. I held up a document, physical, printed, old-fashioned in the way that things which are meant to be irrefutable should sometimes be old-fashioned. We are not asking the Council to create this tribunal. We are informing the Council that it exists. The chamber was very loud for approximately 90 seconds. The arbiter called for order 3 times before she got it. While she was working to restore order, I stood at the platform and waited. I did not look at the Volkai representative. I did not look at the arbiter. I looked at the 6 non-standing delegations in their temporary floor access section, the representatives of civilizations that the hegemony had classified as acceptable trajectory deviations 200 years ago. The ones who had changed everything they were doing because a Tier 6 civilization had told them that who they were becoming was a problem. Some of them were looking back at me. I did not know their species well enough to read their expressions, but I knew the quality of attention. I had felt it before, from the other direction. It was the attention of people who had not expected this day to arrive and were not yet sure what to do with the fact that it had. When the noise settled, something unexpected happened. The Thuresi admiral stood up. He was not seated in the military observer section. He was seated with the Thuresi member delegation because he had, apparently, submitted a formal request to address the chamber in his capacity as a member species representative rather than a military observer. The arbiter acknowledged him with visible surprise. He stood without hurrying. He was older than I remembered from our brief channel exchange 11 months ago, or perhaps I simply had not been paying attention to the details of him then. He had the bearing of someone who had spent a long time in positions of authority and had developed a stillness that went with it. I was present at the Volkai operation against Earth, he said. His translator rendered his voice without inflection, but I had spent enough time with alien translation systems by now to hear what lay beneath. I filed observation logs. I received the human distress signal. I did not respond to it because, under the protocol, I was not required to. What I did was legal. He paused. I have thought about what was legal and what was correct every day since. They are not the same thing. I believe that the fact that they are not the same thing is a failure not of any individual, but of the system we have built together. I am seconding the human tribunal framework, not because I am required to, but because the alternative is continuing to operate a system that allows legal events to occur that none of us, if we are honest, believe are correct. He sat down. 17 other delegations rose immediately after. Not all Thuresi. 4 were species I did not recognize, members I had not tracked during the proceedings. 3 were from the 6 non-standing delegations that had been added to the chamber before the session. The Volkai representative was on his feet, objecting. The arbiter was calling for order. The chamber was operating at a volume that suggested the translation systems were working very hard. Owen leaned toward me from the seat behind me. "Is this going the way you planned?" he asked quietly. "Mostly," I said. "The Admiral was not in the plan." "Good surprise or bad surprise?" "Good," I said. "Definitely good." Clara was watching the delegations with the expression she used when she was processing something that had more variables than she had initially accounted for. She had spent 6 months solving a physics problem that most engineers considered theoretically possible but practically impossible. She had done it by accepting that the variables she had not anticipated were not obstacles but information, and adjusting accordingly. 21 delegations standing, she said quietly, counting. If the 6 non-standing ones are counted, 24. They might not be counted for voting purposes, Owen said. No, she agreed, but the fact that they are standing will be in the record. The session continued for another 4 hours. I will not recount all of it. The important pieces were these. The Interstellar Civilizational Accountability Framework was formally noted by the Council as a legally distinct instrument, which was the most they could do without voting to adopt it, and a vote to adopt it had been called for by 11-member delegations, which meant it would be on the next session agenda. The Volkai hegemony's request for a Council enforcement order against human vessels was tabled for review, which was Council language for being placed in a process that could take between 2 and 5 years to resolve, and which everyone in the room understood was not going to result in an enforcement order. The Volkai representative left before the session formally closed. He did not say anything as he left. He simply stood and gathered his materials and walked out, which was the kind of departure that carries its own message without requiring words. The message was not acceptance. I had not expected acceptance. What I had expected, and what I saw in the room as the session wound toward its conclusion, was something subtler. The quality of attention in the chamber had changed over the 4 hours. It had come in with the specific weight of an institution examining an anomaly and trying to categorize it. It was leaving with something closer to the quality of attention you give to a new element in a landscape that you thought you understood. At the conclusion of proceedings, the arbiter said something that I had not expected. She addressed the chamber generally, which was unusual for a closing statement, and she said, "This session has demonstrated that the instruments by which this council operates require review. What has occurred over the past year has not been anticipated by our existing frameworks. Unanticipated events are, by definition, the most important ones." She was a bureaucrat. I had come in expecting nothing from the bureaucrats. It was, I recognized, a form of assumption that I needed to work on. After the chamber cleared, I found myself standing on the observation deck outside the main assembly corridor. The deck overlooked an open section of Meridian Station's core, a wide atrium that went up and down far enough in both directions that the ends were not visible. Species moved through it at their own speeds in their own directions, the ordinary traffic of a place where business was conducted every day. Louise Farrar came to stand beside me. She looked out at the atrium without saying anything for a while. "Is it over?" she asked eventually. "This part," I said. "What does the next part look like?" I thought about it honestly. The tribunal framework would be challenged. The Volkai were not finished. The tier classification system was still in place, and the council was still the council, an institution built over centuries on principles that had mostly served its existing members well and had not been designed with anyone else in mind. The Admiral's speech had been remarkable, but one remarkable speech did not change centuries of institutional momentum. It shifted something. It did not replace it. The 6 species in the non-standing section would go home to their interrupted development civilizations and report what they had witnessed. Some of them would draw conclusions that led somewhere useful. Others would not be certain what to do with what they had seen. That was fine. Certainty was not required at this stage. Attention was required. Attention was what they were leaving with. The hegemony would regroup. They would not simply accept the precedent of 17 engagements without a response. Their response would come through channels we had not fully mapped yet, which meant that the work of the next months would involve a great deal of careful monitoring and faster adaptation than we had managed so far. Clara was already thinking about it. She had mentioned, on the transit to Meridian, that the grief drives at half yield produced a different resonance signature that might have navigational applications we had not explored. I had told her to write it down. She had said she already had. It looks like a long argument, I said, one we are now inside rather than outside of. She nodded slowly. That is better, she said. Yes, I agreed, that is better. We stood there a while longer. Through the station's outer ports, which were visible from a certain angle on the observation deck, you could see open space. Stars, ordinary ones, distant and steady and uninterested in anything happening near them. I thought about the emergency beacon I had sealed and set transmitting 11 months ago. I wondered if it was still out there, still broadcasting its slow outward spiral, the recording of my voice saying into the dark that we were not finished, and we were not asking for anything, and we were making a record. Somewhere behind me in the atrium, a group of Elurian delegates were talking among themselves, their voices too quiet and too distant to translate. Clara Osai was across the deck, speaking with two individuals I did not recognize, pointing at something on the display surface of her hand unit, already working. Owen was somewhere inside the chamber talking to someone from the 6 non-standing delegations about the tribunal process. Ren Kaplan and Dan Whitfield had gone to find food, which in their case probably meant finding a corner of the station's provisioning area and talking through the next tactical problem while eating something that tasted approximately like food and was mostly nutritional. Petra Yates had gone back to the ship, because she had noticed a vibration in the 3rd drive node during the transit, and she was not going to stop thinking about it until she had diagnosed and corrected it. That was what the crew of the first Mark did. They kept working. 328 million people were 2 kilometers below the surface of a gray and slowly greening world, working. I had told the council on my first visit that we had very good memories. That was true. But memory alone was not what had carried us from that burning orbit to this observation deck in 11 months. Memory was the fuel. What burned it was something harder to name, the specific quality of a species that had been told, implicitly and explicitly, by the silence of 17 fleets and the language of a non-interference protocol, that it did not matter enough to save. Being told you do not matter enough is a very dangerous thing to say to anyone. It is especially dangerous to say to humans, who have a deep and persistent habit of taking that kind of statement personally and spending the rest of their available energy proving it wrong. Not out of anger, or not only out of anger, out of something more basic. The same thing that made Priya Holly splint her own leg with a cabinet handle and ask about the external situation before she asked about the pain. The same thing that made Clara Osai solve an unsolvable containment problem in a bunker 2 kilometers underground because there was no one else to solve it and it needed solving. The same thing that made Louise Farrar get on a ship she had never seen before and go to a system she had never visited to help a species she had never met, and do it without complaint, because someone asked her to and she understood why. The stars outside the port looked the same as they always had, still, ancient, unreachable in all the ways that had mattered before and fewer of the ways that mattered now. They had watched Earth burn. And then, when humanity's grief drives fired simultaneously in 17 different locations across the Elurian system, and the gravitational resonance propagated outward through every FTL communication array in range, every council vessel within 8 light-years had heard it. Not as a weapon, not as a signal, as a sound, raw and unbuffered, the byproduct of an engine built from annihilated matter and focused loss, washing through communication systems that had never been designed to receive it. They had called it screaming. I did not think it sounded like screaming. I had been there when the drives fired. I knew what the resonance felt like from inside the ship that was producing it. It did not feel like a scream. It felt like a statement, the kind that does not ask for a response, the kind that simply makes clear that something has changed, and the change is permanent, and the universe is now a different shape than it was before. I turned away from the port. Louise was looking at me. She had the expression of someone who had more questions than she was going to ask right now, which was one of the things I valued most about her. The questions she held quietly were always worth more than the ones that came rushing out. "We should get back to the ship," I said. "Where are we going next?" she asked. I pulled up the navigation display on my hand unit. There were 11 hegemony staging points that our analysts had flagged in the past 3 weeks. There were 2 species on the Volkai audit list whose next scheduled evaluation date was within the next 8 months. There was a council subcommittee meeting on tier reclassification in 6 weeks that we had been asked to send a representative to. There was a message from one of the 6 non-standing delegations requesting a meeting on terms that sounded like they were thinking about co-signing the tribunal framework. There was also a message from Priya Hollies, sent from the rehabilitation facility on Harith Point, 3 words long: "Ready when you are." I had read it 4 times since it arrived. I had not yet replied, not because I did not know what to say, but because some messages deserve to be answered in person. I closed the display. "Forward," I said. We walked back through the observation deck, through the main corridor, past the atrium and its ordinary traffic of ordinary beings living in a galaxy that was now, in small but permanent ways, different from the one they had woken up in 11 months ago. I thought about what the Arbiter had said. Unanticipated events are, by definition, the most important ones. She had said it about us, about what humanity had done, but I turned it around in my mind as I walked and found that it applied to something else too. The most important thing that had happened in that chamber today was not our legal argument, solid as it was. It was not the tribunal framework, necessary as it was. It was an old admiral standing up in a room full of his peers and saying clearly and on the record that he had done something legal that was not correct, and that the difference between those 2 things mattered, and that he intended to act on that difference. That was unanticipated, not by me exactly. I had hoped for something like it, but hope is a different thing from anticipation, and what he had done was larger than my hope had been. The stars outside did not scream again, but they had learned to listen. And that in the end was the thing that mattered most, not that we had made them afraid, not that we had made them respect us in the way that power demands respect from other power. We had made them pay attention, in the way that you pay attention to something that has surprised you once and you have decided will not surprise you in the same way again. That kind of attention is different from the observation logs that 17 fleets had filed while Earth burned. It is active. It is engaged. It expects to be surprised again and has decided to be present for it. Humans do not need to be the most powerful thing in the room. We just need to be in the room. We are in the room now, and we intend to stay.